February 3rd, 1944, Leipzig, Germany. The hospital was wrapped in a thick silence as Martha Weiss pushed the metal tray down the white corridor. There were no screams, no gunshots, only the soft brush of her steps and the almost inaudible clink of syringes against the sterilized tray. It was the early hours of morning, the safest shift, the one in which no one asked questions. Fluorescent lights washed over the rooms where the men slept, men who, during the day, signed execution orders. SS officers, decorated and untouchable, now still and fragile, arms extended, waiting for another dose of morphine, penicillin, vitamins, placing complete trust in the white uniform that approached their beds each night. Marta wore the correct uniform, the precise expression, the exact obedience. No one saw the Jewish woman behind the German nurse. No one checked the false surname on her ID. No one distrusted someone who hadn't made a single visible mistake in 18 months of flawless work. Since starting at that military hospital, she had learned something essential. Trust kills more effectively than any weapon. No one checked a needle twice. No one questioned an efficient nurse. No one imagined death could arrive wrapped in routine, dressed as care, scented with medicinal alcohol. On the tray lay 2 identical syringes. One had been sterilized according to protocol. The other had spent 3 days submerged in a jar of dirty water, exposed to floor bacteria, to dried blood particles, to organic residues, invisible but lethal. Marta knew exactly which one to use, and she knew something else. The infection would not be immediate. There would be no suspicion. Just fever days later, then confusion, then sepsis, and finally, a definitive silence. The medical certificate would speak of post-operative complications or a hospital-acquired infection. It always did, and no one ever investigated further. As she tightened the tourniquet around the right arm of a sleeping Obersturmführer, she remembered the last time she had seen her father. A railway station in Leipzig, a shove toward a cattle car, a look that tried to cling to her face and couldn't. No one signed that crime. No one answered for it. No one counted how many died along the way. The needle slipped through the skin without resistance. The man did not wake. Marta did not tremble. Her pulse did not race. Her hands did not sweat. She had learned to turn terror into precision. She withdrew the syringe calmly, covered the arm with sterile gauze, and continued down the corridor as if nothing had happened. Because to survive there, the key was not hatred, but invisibility. To become air, shadow, furniture. And in that military hospital in Leipzig, no one suspected the Jewish nurse who each night transformed a gesture of care into a slow, bacterial, silent sentence. Between January 1943 and April 1944, 17 SS officers died there. None fell in combat, all from medical complications. Martha Weiss left no trace. By 1944, Germany had already lost the war, though no one dared say it aloud. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Red Army. Daily came news of retreats, of entire divisions erased in the Russian vastness, of cities liberated that had once been taken with fanfare. German cities were beginning to burn under Allied bombings. At night, sirens wailed and families ran to basements as the sky turned orange. Yet inside the military hospitals, far from mud and shrapnel, the illusion of control endured. Clean wards, starched uniforms, intact hierarchies. The doctors continued issuing orders with the same authority as always. The nurses obeyed with identical precision. The wounded officers remained convinced that their sacrifices still had meaning, that final victory depended only on time and will. Leipzig, in the region of Saxony, was a key industrial city for the German war effort. Its factories produced munitions day and night. The smoke from their chimneys never stopped. Trains departed eastward in a constant flow that seemed endless. Hospitals received wounded officers who still believed in ultimate victory, men with medals on their chests and injuries to thighs, arms, and shoulders. The military hospital of the 4th District was one of the largest in the region. 3 stories of red brick. 120 beds spread across large wards with tall windows. German doctors overseeing every detail. Polish orderlies doing the work the Germans considered beneath them. Exclusively military patients. Enlisted men in the basement, crammed into metal bunks that creaked at night. Mid-level officers on the 2nd floor, with cleaner sheets and less watery food. SS commanders on the 3rd floor, in private rooms with heavy curtains and bedside tables, where they kept books, watches, and family photographs. No one questioned the hierarchy. It was as natural as gravity, and no one questioned cleanliness. It was a German point of pride, and absolutely no one distrusted a nurse who had worked 18 months without a single formal complaint, without documented errors, without a recorded act of insubordination. But there was something the system never accounted for, that someone might turn trust into a weapon, that the white uniform could conceal not only a body, but a forbidden identity, that efficiency could become the perfect camouflage for a silent war fought at the edges of routine, between bandages and thermometers, between syringes and medical charts. Martha Weiss should not have existed. Her real surname had been Weiss, a name tied for generations to Jewish watchmakers and merchants in Leipzig. Yet her employment papers identified her as Martha Müller, a surname so common in Germany it could belong to anyone. Her birth certificate had been forged by a Polish clerk named Thomas, a man who hated Germans more than he feared the consequences. He risked his life for a stranger and a gold ring, and she never saw him again after a quick exchange in a damp basement that smelled of mold and fear. Her face was ordinary enough not to draw attention. Light brown hair pulled into a tight bun, gray eyes that revealed nothing, features that could belong to any middle-class woman in the region. She was neither beautiful nor ugly. She was invisible, and that kept her alive. She spoke German without an accent, without inflections that might reveal origin or religious difference. From childhood, she had learned to imitate the Christian German of her neighbors and to suppress any trace of Yiddish that might betray her. She knew medical protocols better than some doctors trained at prestigious universities. She could suture without leaving visible scars, recognize signs of shock before they became obvious, tell when a patient needed morphine and when he needed only silence. She never made mistakes in front of witnesses. That was why no one suspected her for 18 months. That was why she remained alive when so many others vanished. Marta was 27 when she began working at the hospital, but she looked older, not because of wrinkles, but because of the way she held her gaze. There was something dimmed in her eyes, as if she had stopped expecting anything good, as if she had accepted that life was a sequence of days to be survived, not enjoyed. Before the war, she had studied nursing at a small technical institute in Leipzig. It was not a prestigious profession. Girls from good families trained to become teachers or secretaries. Nursing was for those who needed to work, for those without a sufficient dowry for a good marriage. But Marta liked precision. She liked knowing that a properly placed bandage could prevent infection, that the correct dosage could save a life, that technical knowledge made the difference between living and dying. That version of herself died in 1941. That was the year the Nazis began mass deportations in Leipzig. First they took the young men, the ones who could resist, who might organize. Then the elderly, the unproductive, those deemed a burden to the Reich. Finally, they came for entire families, women, children, infants, without distinction. The machine made none. The Weiss family was no exception. They were neither wealthy nor influential. They had no contacts capable of saving them. They were middle-class Jews in a city that no longer wanted them. Her father, Jacob, was a watchmaker. A quiet man with small hands and precise fingers, he repaired antique clocks in a tiny workshop near the central market. He spent hours bent over minute mechanisms, adjusting gears with infinite patience, and used to say that clocks were like mechanical hearts. If you understood their rhythm, you could bring them back to life. Her mother, Esther, embroidered tablecloths that she sold at local fairs. She created intricate floral designs with colored threads bought from a Jewish shop that no longer existed. Her hands were always busy. Even when she spoke, her fingers moved through the air as if stitching invisible words. Her younger sister, Ruth, was 16 and dreamed of becoming a pianist. She played in a synagogue that was burned in 1938, and afterward practiced on an out-of-tune piano in the home of a Christian neighbor who felt pity, though not enough to take real risks. Ruth had long fingers and a smile capable of lighting up dark rooms. In September 1941, all three were arrested. Marta was not home that night. She had gone out to find medicine for her mother, whose chronic bronchitis worsened every winter. When she returned 2 hours later, she found the door open, its hinges twisted, furniture overturned. The photographs her mother kept in silver frames crushed underfoot on the wooden floor. On the wall, pinned like a verdict, was an official paper stamped by the Gestapo that read simply, "Jewish population evacuated, property confiscated by the Reich." Marta never saw her family again. There was no trial, no explanation, no goodbyes, only a list of names in a gray office and a train heading east that no one ever spoke about afterward. What remained was silence, settling over the city like a dense fog no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone breathed. For weeks, Marta slept in other people's basements, in damp corners where rats ran at night. She ate scraps of stale bread and rotten potatoes pulled from trash bins and waited to be arrested herself. Every time she heard German boots in the street, she pressed herself against the wall, waiting for the door to open. But it didn't happen. No one was actively looking for her. Her name wasn't on the priority lists. She was too young, too insignificant, too invisible to merit immediate attention. That was when she met Thomas, at a black market where forged documents were sold alongside bread and cigarettes. He was a Polish forger who worked by day at the civil registry and by night fabricated certificates. He offered her something impossible: a new identity, a new surname, a Catholic baptism certificate with convincing seals, a complete biography. All of it in exchange for a gold ring that had belonged to her grandmother, a piece Marta had hidden in the hem of her coat. She accepted without hesitation, not out of hope, but because the alternative was waiting to die in a cold basement. In January 1943, Marta Weiss, Jewish nurse, officially ceased to exist in the records of the Reich. In her place was born Marta Müller, certified auxiliary nurse, Catholic, baptized in 1916, orphaned by parents killed in a bombing in Hamburg. Her documents were flawless, her references false, but believable. 2 weeks later, she was hired at the 4th District Military Hospital. No one asked many questions. Staff was urgently needed. The wounded were arriving in constant waves from the Eastern Front, and experienced nurses were becoming increasingly scarce. Marta knew how to suture. She knew how to give injections without leaving bruises. She knew how to obey without questioning. For them, that was enough. But Marta was not there to heal. She had come because during those weeks hidden in basements, she had understood something essential. To survive, it wasn't enough to hide outside. You had to hide inside. Inside the system. Inside the uniform. Inside the blind trust of people who would never imagine that a nurse could be dangerous, that hands meant to heal could also kill. And she understood something else. Revenge didn't need to be loud or immediate, nor fair in the way books describe it. It only needed to be precise, calculated, patient. Each dead officer was a cycle interrupted, an order that would never be given, a train that might not depart, a list that might remain incomplete, a family that could survive one more day because the man who was going to sign their deportation lay dead in a hospital bed. Marta didn't see herself as a heroine. She didn't believe in divine justice, nor did she expect history to remember her. There was no greatness in what she did, no nobility. Only the need to use what she knew to return, little by little, a fraction of the pain that had been taken from her. Maintaining that double life, however, came at a price she paid every day. When she looked at herself in the mirror of the tiny room she rented in a boarding house, she saw a stranger, a woman with her face but not her name, an imposture held together by forged credentials and an invented biography. Each night, as she closed her eyes on a hard mattress that smelled of mold, the station returned, the cattle car, her father's hand lifting in a farewell gesture that was never completed. And every time she held a syringe, she felt the weight of an irreversible decision accumulating night after night, like an invisible debt growing inside her. The 4th District Military Hospital ran with German precision. 12-hour shifts that began exactly at 6 in the morning and ended at 6 in the evening. Meticulous records of every patient, every medication, every procedure. Rigid protocols that left no room for improvisation. Everything was designed to project control, efficiency, superiority, to prove that the Reich was invincible even in illness, even in injury. The staff was organized into clear hierarchies that mirrored the regime's social structure. At the top were the German doctors, men trained at prestigious universities like Heidelberg and Berlin, party members with impeccable credentials, convinced that medicine was an extension of the natural order, of racial supremacy, of a science that justified anything. Below them were the head nurses, German women from respectable families, single or war widows, severe supervisors who watched every detail with relentless eyes. They smoothed sheets searching for wrinkles, inspected instruments for stains, timed schedules with stopwatches, and tolerated neither mistakes nor weakness. At the base were the auxiliary nurses and cleaning staff, mostly Poles, Czechs, or Ukrainians brought from occupied territories to do the work no one wanted. Cleaning vomit, emptying chamber pots, changing blood-soaked bandages. People without voice or rights, existing only to serve. Marta occupied a strange place within that structure. Officially, she was an auxiliary nurse, but her level of competence was clearly higher. She knew how to place catheters without causing pain, read vital signs better than some supervisors, anticipate doctors' needs during surgeries, and, above all, she knew when to stay silent, when to disappear, when to become invisible. Dr. Heinrich Bollmer, the hospital's chief physician, appreciated her especially. Dr. Bollmer had seen her work in extreme situations that would have broken other nurses. A post-operative hemorrhage that covered the floor in blood within seconds. A respiratory arrest that required intubating a patient without anesthesia. An emergency amputation performed on a kitchen table because the operating room was occupied. In all those moments, Marta remained calm, exact, almost mechanical. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not break. Her face showed no emotion. She was the perfect nurse, efficient, silent, obedient. Bulmer was not cruel in the usual sense. He did not torture prisoners in basements, nor did he shout at subordinates for pleasure. He did not enjoy the suffering of others. It simply did not interest him. To him, patients were interesting or tedious clinical cases. Jews were an administrative problem belonging to other departments. The war was a logistical nuisance that complicated the supply of medicines. He embodied something worse than hatred: technical indifference. Clean, orderly evil without guilt. The kind of man capable of ordering a forced sterilization before lunch and debating anatomy over dinner without perceiving any contradiction. And he trusted Marta completely. That trust was her most powerful weapon. For the first 6 months, Marta did nothing. She only observed. She learned the shifts of every nurse, every doctor, every security guard. She memorized routines with near photographic precision and identified the moments when no one was paying attention. The early morning hours between 3 and 5, when a single on-duty nurse struggled against sleep. Sunday afternoons, when doctors left early to see their families. Nights of bombing, when everyone ran to the basement and the third floor was left completely empty. She also understood something crucial. Deaths from infection did not raise suspicion in a military hospital. Infections were common, almost inevitable. Patients arrived from the front with open wounds treated in mud or snow with dirty instruments, and sterilization conditions were not always ideal, even there. Soap was scarce. Antibiotics were limited. Resistant bacteria already existed, even if no one fully understood them yet. If an officer died of sepsis 3 days after a successful surgery, no one blamed the nurse who had administered his painkillers. They blamed the war, the body's exhaustion, bad luck, the will of God. There was always a convenient explanation that avoided uncomfortable investigations. Marta did not invent a new method. She simply learned to exploit the cracks in the system, those gray zones where guilt dissolves into complexity. She began with minimal gestures, reusing a needle that had fallen on the floor, forgetting to sterilize an instrument before suturing, leaving a damp bandage too long on an open wound to create the ideal environment for bacteria. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable, nothing that looked intentional. And then something unexpected happened. None of those patients died. Some developed mild infections that were cured with sulfonamides. Others showed no symptoms at all. Human fragility was unpredictable. Bacteria did not always win, and the body possessed mysterious defenses that science did not yet fully understand. Marta realized she had to be more deliberate, more methodical, more lethal. She began cultivating her own bacteria, not in a laboratory, but in glass jars hidden in her small rented room. Stagnant water from a nearby pond where dogs drank, garden soil mixed with manure, organic remains left to decompose for weeks. She submerged needles for days, allowing microorganisms to colonize the metal and cling to every microscopic groove. Then she dried them carefully with a clean cloth and carried them in her pocket, wrapped in boiled fabric so they appeared sterile. No one checked nurses' pockets. No one imagined that someone might deliberately carry contaminated instruments. When the precise moment arrived, she swapped them for the sterilized needles on the tray. A quick gesture while walking down an empty corridor, imperceptible, natural. And then she waited. 3 days later, Officer Klaus Reinhard developed a fever. He was 31 years old and had a face that inspired trust. Blonde hair slicked back with pomade, a firm jaw, an easy smile that revealed straight, white teeth. He could have passed for a university professor, someone ready to debate philosophy over a cup of coffee, not an SS officer who had overseen the cleansing of entire villages. He had arrived at the hospital in January 1944 with a shrapnel wound to his left thigh. Nothing serious. A small fragment removed in 20 minutes. The surgery was a success. The suturing flawless. The prognosis excellent. He would return to the front in 6 weeks. He was recovering in a private room on the 3rd floor, reserved for high-ranking officers. On his bedside table lay books. Goethe's poetry, essays by Nietzsche, an adventure novel. He received visits from fellow officers who brought cigarettes and news from the front, and he spoke to the nurses as if they were people, not servants. But Marta knew who he really was. Before being hospitalized, Reinhard had commanded a special unit in the occupied Eastern Territories. His work did not involve fighting soldiers in conventional battles, but cleansing problematic villages, organizing deportations based on lists prepared in advance, and supervising mass executions carried out with industrial efficiency. He did not act with rage or sadism, but with forms in triplicate, precise schedules, and an almost exemplary administrative neatness. He was the kind of man who made sure bullets were not wasted, that mass graves had the correct dimensions, that records were always up to date. He could order the deaths of 300 people before lunch and read poetry in the afternoon without perceiving any contradiction. For him, there was none. It was work, orders, duty. Marta learned this after overhearing a conversation she never forgot. One night, while changing sheets in the adjoining room, she heard Reinhard speaking with another officer. They laughed, shared anecdotes, exchanged stories as if discussing office projects. One mentioned a village in Ukraine. The other asked if it wasn't the one he had cleaned in 2 days. Reinhard replied casually, 2.5. There were logistical problems with the trains. The station was occupied by an ammunition transport, and they had to wait. They spoke as if discussing a construction project, as if lives were numbers on a spreadsheet and horror mere administration. That night, Marta decided Reinhard would be next. It was not an emotional reaction. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She felt no blind rage. She simply added his name to a mental list she carried in silence, a list that grew slowly, like an unpaid debt. For a week, she cared for him with her usual efficiency. She changed his bandages twice a day, administered antibiotics on schedule, smiled politely when he made a condescending remark about how good her hands were, as if praising a well-trained animal. Reinhard trusted her. Everyone trusted her. And that trust was what killed them. On February 3rd, Marta arrived for her night shift with a specially prepared syringe. She had left it submerged for 4 days in water contaminated with soil from a nearby cemetery. It wasn't superstition, it was pragmatism. Cemetery soil contained high concentrations of Clostridium, anaerobic bacteria capable of causing deep infections, resistant to the available antibiotics and lethal in most cases. At 3 a.m, she entered Reinhard's room carrying her metal tray. He was sleeping deeply, sedated by morphine administered 2 hours earlier. His breathing was slow, his face calm, almost childlike. Marta prepared everything calmly and set the tray down on the bedside table without making a sound. She adjusted the lamp to better see the vein in his arm and tied the tourniquet with precise, practiced, professional movements. The vein rose beneath the pale skin. She did not hesitate. She did not tremble. She felt no pity. The needle went in cleanly, the injection flawless. The contaminated liquid flowed into the bloodstream, carrying millions of bacteria that would begin multiplying within hours. She withdrew the needle, pressed the entry point with cotton, and covered the arm with sterile gauze. Reinhard did not move. He kept sleeping, kept dreaming, kept believing he would wake up the next morning as always. Marta slipped the contaminated syringe into her pocket, wiped the tray with alcohol, turned off the lamp, and left without a sound. No one saw her. No one asked questions. No one suspected anything. In the hallway, she passed another nurse, who smiled at her with exhaustion. Marta returned the smile. They exchanged whispered greetings, spoke about the cold, about the endless shift, about how far away dawn still was. Then each went her separate way, like any other night, as if nothing had happened. 4 days later, Klaus Reinhard developed a high fever. The doctors attributed it to a late post-operative infection and administered sulfonamides, the antibiotics available at the time, expecting the fever to subside within 24 hours. It did not. His temperature rose to 40 degrees Celsius. Violent chills shook the entire bed, followed by delirium. Reinhard began talking to himself, shouting names, begging for water in a hoarse voice. Dr. Bollmer ordered blood tests, but the results were inconclusive. In 1944, severe bacterial infections did not always leave clear patterns. Microbiology was still in its infancy. No electron microscopes, no rapid cultures, only clinical observation and reasonable conjecture. 7 days after the injection, Reinhard went into septic shock. His blood pressure collapsed. His organs began to fail. His skin turned gray. 10 days later, he died. The death certificate read, "Post-operative septicemia, complications resulting from a combat wound." No one questioned the diagnosis. In wartime, it was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It happened all the time. Marta assisted Dr. Bollmer during the superficial autopsy and remained silent, professional, expressionless, as the physician opened the body searching for the source of the infection. At the end of her shift, she walked back to her small room through empty streets. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for 20 minutes without moving, without thinking, without feeling. There was no triumph, no relief. Only a strange emptiness, as if she had crossed an invisible line she could never return from. That night, for the first time in months, she cried. Not for Reinhard, she felt no pity for him, but because she understood something terrible. She was becoming what she hated most. Someone who decided who lived and who died. Someone who used the power of the system against the system itself. Someone who killed with the same technical coldness as they did. But she did not stop. If she did, none of it would make sense. The deaths would be just deaths. The blood on her hands would be only blood, and she would be reduced to a murderer without purpose. Over the next 3 months, she developed a rhythm. She did not act every week. Sometimes she let an entire month pass without doing anything, devoting herself to her work as usual. She could not create visible patterns or arouse suspicion. Patience was her ally. She chose her victims with cold criteria. She did not touch enlisted soldiers who merely followed orders without alternatives, nor the gravely wounded who were already dying. Only SS officers with known records, men who had given direct orders, signed deportation lists, slept peacefully after destroying entire lives without remorse. Her methods evolved as well. She stopped relying solely on contaminated needles and began manipulating medication dosages. A slight overdose of morphine could cause respiratory depression and appear natural. An insufficient dose of insulin in a diabetic could induce a coma from which he would never wake. An anticoagulant administered before a minor surgery could trigger internal bleeding that surgeons did not detect until it was far too late. None of it was detectable without a deep investigation, and no one investigated. The doctors were overwhelmed. Hospitals received dozens of wounded every week, and deaths became numbers in reports, not mysteries worthy of attention. Marta learned to be patient, to wait for the right moment, to leave no emotional traces, to not alter her routine after each death, to not look at the bodies longer than strictly necessary. But she also discovered something unsettling. Killing became easier with time. The first time, she cried for hours. The second, she felt nauseous all day. The third, only exhaustion. From the fourth on, it turned into routine, just another procedure among many, a task to complete before the shift ended. That transformation terrified her, not because she felt moral guilt for killing men she considered guilty, but because she understood she was losing something essential: the ability to feel the true weight of what she was doing. She was becoming an efficient, technical, cold, calculating killer, just like them, and yet she couldn't stop. Because stopping meant accepting that everything had been useless, that the deaths changed nothing, that the war would continue its course no matter how many officers disappeared, that the system was too vast for any individual act of resistance. That was when she met Marta Lewin. Marta Lewin was a Polish auxiliary nurse on the afternoon shift. She was 34, with a tired face carved by deep lines around the eyes and rough hands from washing sheets in cold water without enough soap. Marta had never spoken much with her. They exchanged polite greetings, shared patient information during shift changes, but nothing personal, nothing that created a bond. Until one afternoon in March, when they were alone in the supply room organizing bandages. Marta Lewin carefully closed the door, checked that the hallway was empty, and looked Marta straight in the eyes. "I know what you are," she said softly, in Polish. Marta felt the floor vanish beneath her feet. Her heart raced, and instinctively her hand moved toward the pocket where she kept her forged ID. She thought of running, of denying everything, of silencing her before she spoke to anyone else. But Marta Lewin raised a hand, asking for calm. "I'm not going to say anything," she whispered, "but you have to be more careful. Dr. Bolmer is starting to ask questions. Too many patients on the third floor are dying. Too many unexplained infections in young, healthy men." Marta didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed, her mind racing through denials and excuses that refused to take shape. Marta Lewin went on, her voice calm but firm. She didn't know how Marta was doing it, and didn't want to know. But if she were discovered, she wouldn't die alone. They would review everything, investigate everyone, interrogate every nurse on those shifts. And she had 2 children hidden on a farm to the north. If they dug into her past, or found any connection, those children would die too. The silence grew dense, filling the small room. At last, Marta asked in a hoarse voice why she wasn't turning her in. Marta Lewin looked at her with something that might have been compassion, or perhaps pure existential exhaustion. Because she understood why she was doing it. Because if she had her courage, she might do the same. But also because she knew Marta couldn't win that war alone. No one could. And if Marta died, if she were discovered, everything she had done would mean nothing. She would become nothing more than an example of Jewish terrorism, useful for propaganda. Then she left the room without another word, leaving Marta alone with her thoughts and her fear. That conversation changed something fundamental in her. It didn't stop her, but it reminded her of something she had forgotten. Her life did not belong only to her. Her survival affected others, and every decision dragged along invisible consequences that spread far beyond what she could control. She decided to be more careful, to space the deaths out, change methods more frequently, rotate between floors, and never act twice in the same week. But Dr. Bulmer had already begun to suspect. In late March 1944, Dr. Heinrich Bulmer called an extraordinary meeting of the medical staff, something unusual, reserved only for major administrative changes or health crises requiring immediate attention. Marta attended with the others, sat in the back as always, kept her expression neutral, her hands still in her lap, her breathing measured. Bulmer spoke for 10 minutes about sterilization protocols, about the importance of surgical cleanliness, and about the troubling rise in post-operative infections in the west wing of the hospital, particularly on the 3rd floor. He mentioned no names and accused no one directly, but his eyes slowly swept the room, assessing faces, looking for nervousness, looking for guilt. Marta held his gaze when it reached her. She didn't look away or show unease. She remained as expressionless as ever. Bulmer announced new controls, double checks of instruments, comparisons between shifts and mortality rates, searches for statistical anomalies. Marta understood the real message. Someone was looking closely. Someone had noticed a pattern. The margin of safety was narrowing. That night, she made a decision. She would let at least 2 months pass without acting. She would allow the numbers to normalize, suspicions to fade, Bulmer to convince himself that it had all been simple bad luck. But fate had other plans. On April 15, 1944, the hospital received a direct order from High Command. All identified Jewish patients in military hospitals were to be transferred immediately to labor camps. Their medical condition didn't matter. Whether they were dying didn't matter. Whether they had served in the German army before the racial laws didn't matter. Nothing mattered except racial classification. The order was clear and brutal, ethnic cleansing even within military hospitals. Bulmer received it without objection and began personally reviewing medical records, searching for Jewish names, suspicious conversions, any trace of impure blood. He started asking questions about staff and verifying birth certificates. Marta knew it was only a matter of time before her name appeared on some cross-referenced list, before someone noticed an inconsistency in her papers, before the question arose of why such a competent nurse had appeared out of nowhere in 1943 without verifiable references. She had 2 options: flee while she still could, or accelerate her work knowing that every day might be her last. She chose the second. Over the next 3 weeks, she acted with a frequency she had never imagined before. 5 officers died in 18 days, all from apparently natural causes: sudden infections, unexpected internal hemorrhages, nighttime cardiac arrests. But the pace was excessive. Patterns were becoming too visible. Probability could no longer sustain the explanation of bad luck. On May 7th, Dr. Bulmer ordered a full internal audit. He wanted to review all deaths from the past 6 months, cross-check shifts against mortality, identify anomalies, find names. Marta Lewin sought her out that same afternoon and found her in the basement, storing clean sheets. "You have to leave now," she said bluntly. Marta shook her head while continuing to fold the sheets with mechanical movements. "I can't," she said. "If I run, I confirm their suspicions, and then they'll investigate you too, and everyone who worked my shifts." Marta grabbed her by the arm, hard. Then stop, at least for a few weeks. Let things cool down. Marta looked at her in silence, and for an instant, her gray eyes showed something they almost never revealed. Resignation. Then she said something Marta Lewin would never forget. If I stop now, everything I've done will have been for nothing. And if it was for nothing, then I really am just a murderer. At least this way I can still believe there was a purpose. That same night she returned to the hospital for the night shift. She knew it would probably be her last. In the early hours of May 10, 1944, Marta Weiss entered the 4th District Military Hospital for the final time. She wore her uniform immaculate, starched and pressed as always. The forged ID hung from her neck, and the metal tray with sterilized syringes gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But this time she carried something else, a small cyanide capsule hidden in the hem of her right sleeve. She had obtained it months earlier through a Polish pharmacist who knew her true identity. It was the size of a large pill and contained enough poison to kill within 5 minutes. It was her final exit, her last act of control, the way to ensure she would not be interrogated, tortured for confessions, or turned into propaganda. The hospital was strangely quiet that night, too quiet. Even the usual sounds, the breathing of sleeping patients, the creaking of metal beds, seemed muffled. When she reached the 3rd floor with her tray, she saw something that froze her blood. 2 Gestapo officers were waiting in the corridor, long black leather coats on, speaking in low voices with Dr. Bulmer. One of them held a thick folder of documents. Marta did not run. She did not scream. She did not show panic. That would have confirmed everything. She turned calmly, as if she had forgotten something downstairs, and walked toward the stairwell at a normal pace. She descended to the 2nd floor without hurrying, aware that she had minutes, perhaps only seconds, before someone spoke her name. She entered an empty storage room where bandages and clean sheets were kept, locked the door, and sat down on the cold, tiled floor with her back against the wall. She took the cyanide capsule from her sleeve and held it between her fingers for a moment that stretched into eternity. She thought of her father bent over tiny clocks, precise hands adjusting invisible gears. She thought of her mother embroidering flowers no one would ever see again. She thought of Ruth playing the piano in a synagogue that no longer existed. She thought of the 17 men she had killed, and of the lives she might have saved by interrupting cycles of violence. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it had all been useless. Perhaps she had only added more death to a world already saturated with death. But she also thought of something else, that she had chosen not to be a passive victim, that she had used the only things she had, her knowledge, her invisibility, her precision, to give back, even in the smallest fraction, the pain that had been taken from her. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't justice. It was simply the only thing she could do with the cards history had dealt her. She heard footsteps in the hallway, voices in German issuing orders, military boots running. Someone shouted a name that wasn't hers, but they were looking for her all the same. Marta Weiss closed her eyes and bit down on the capsule. The taste was bitter, chemical, unbearable. She felt the poison burn her throat as her body began to convulse, muscles locking, air no longer entering her lungs. In those final seconds, as darkness closed in, she felt something unexpected, not fear, not regret, but a cold calm. The serenity of having made her last decision, of having controlled the ending when everything else had been beyond her control. Marta Weiss's body was found 3 hours later by Marta Lewin, who entered the storage room looking for sheets for the morning shift. She did not scream or cry. She closed the door carefully, took a deep breath, and went to find Dr. Bulmer. The investigation was brief and brutal. The Gestapo searched the room and found the jars of contaminated needles hidden beneath loose floorboards, along with notes in a notebook concealed under the mattress. Dates, names, and methods were described with an almost clinical precision. They also found traces of her real identity in documents she had kept, for reasons she herself might not have been able to explain. The official report closed the case by classifying it as sabotage carried out by Jewish elements infiltrated into Reich institutions, and it was archived without further action. There was no public trial, no media exposure. The regime was unwilling to admit that a Jewish woman had operated undetected for 18 months inside a military hospital. It was a humiliation they preferred to bury in classified files. Marta Lewin was interrogated for 2 days in a windowless room. She confessed nothing because, in truth, she knew nothing concrete. She was simply a Polish nurse who followed orders and mentioned only a vague conversation with the deceased. They believed her, or perhaps they simply didn't care enough to dig deeper. Marta Lewin survived the war. Her children did as well. In 1947, she emigrated to Argentina with false documents and never spoke again of what had happened in Leipzig. She never mentioned Marta Weiss. She never told the story. She carried that secret to her grave in 1983. Dr. Heinrich Bulmer continued working at the hospital until January 1945, when the Red Army reached Silesia and the final siege of Leipzig began. He fled west with other German officers and, after the war, opened a private clinic in Bavaria under his own name. He was never tried, never interrogated, never acknowledged having known anything about Marta Weiss. He died in 1967 of natural causes, surrounded by his family. Klaus Reinhard and the other 16 officers who died under her care were buried with military honors in orderly cemeteries. Their names appear on memorials as having fallen in service to the Reich. Their families received pensions, widows' official condolences, and their children grew up proud of fathers who, they were told, had died doing their duty. Marta Weiss has no grave. Her body was cremated without ceremony. There is no monument, no plaque bearing her name, no street, school, or hospital that remembers her. For decades, her story was little more than a whisper, a rumor among survivors told in low voices, a marginal note in a declassified Gestapo report that surfaced in German archives in the 1970s among thousands of similar documents. No one called her a heroine. No one called her a murderer. She simply vanished, as millions of names vanished during the war, erased from records, expelled from memory, reduced to dust. But in 2003, a Polish historian named Anna Kowalski found Marta Weiss's notebook among documents confiscated by the Soviets and archived in Moscow. It was a sparse, almost clinical record of dates and methods. There were no justifications, no laments, no political manifesto, only brief notes in German. February 3rd, Obersturmführer K. Contaminated injection. Clostridium. 4 days. Kowalski published an academic article on the case in a little-known history journal, and it sparked debate in specialized circles. Some called Marta a justified avenger. Others called her a murderer who violated the Hippocratic Oath. Some argued that she saved lives by interrupting chains of command. Others that she merely added more death to a system already saturated with death. The truth is that no one can know for certain. What is known is this. Between January 1943 and May 1944, Marta Weiss worked in a German military hospital under a false identity, and during that time, 17 SS officers died under her care. None fell in combat. All died from medical complications the doctors were never able to fully explain, and none ever gave another order, signed another list, or supervised another deportation. 17 interrupted cycles. 17 gaps in the machinery. Whether that changed anything is impossible to know. History offers no controlled experiments. We cannot know what would have happened if those men had lived, how many orders they would have given, how many trains would have departed, how many names would have been added to lists. Marta Weiss was 27 years old when she decided that the only way to survive was to disappear inside the very system that was trying to kill her. She was 28 when she understood that disappearing was not enough, that surviving without resisting was merely another way of dying. And she was 29 when she decided she would rather choose her own ending than wait for others to choose it for her. She left no will. She wrote no letters. She offered no explanations or justifications. She left no final words for posterity, only a silence that still echoes. And she left behind a question with no clear answer. Was her life a quiet victory, or simply another tragedy in a world saturated with tragedy? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was neither. Maybe the only thing that matters is that someone, somewhere, remembers her name when all those who ordered her death have long been forgotten. That someone knows she existed. That someone understands she resisted with the only weapons she had. If you know someone from your city, from your country, whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. Perhaps the next invisible hero will be yours.